Hello. So let's have a look. We have our basic sourcing, and now I just generally want to get a volume simulation out of these sources that collides. It doesn't need to be 100%, but it needs to collide somewhat with the sphere. So I have a sphere at the origin here, so I'm going to extrude this now quickly. What do I want? Extrude, poly extrude. We need to add some thickness to this for the collision volume. So that should do that. And then what I'm going to do is try and set up a DOP from scratch instead of using the shelf tool. So I need to think of what all these new sourcing options are. For starters, let me just add a noise to these velocities. So I'll use an attribute noise, see if that works for us. And I want, let's try multiplicative on V, and just mess it up a bit, but still maintain that radial velocity. So from 0 to 1. Something like that should work. Just mess it up. And then we need a pyro source, I think. And right now I'm also going to drop down a DOP network, and we'll call this our advector. So if I put a smoke object in here, I can just use the division size here to set the division size of the voxels in the source. Now there might be another DOP source I'm not remembering. So we have a pyro source, and this is the one that should be generating the fields or the attributes that the volume source uses. So here we want to source smoke. I have density, temperature, and I'll add in our velocity attribute. Use the input. So that's just our attributes, and then I need the actual volume, which I guess is just a rasterize. I'm not sure if there's a separate source. I can actually just check the portal quickly. Volume rasterize attributes. There we go. And I'll set the voxel size to also be the same as the DOP. And our DOP is set to 0.2, so let's just go with 0.1, see if we can start seeing anything. Okay. Here we go. So density, temperature, and velocity. There we go. So I'll take that, make that smaller. So something like that is pretty good. Let me go a little bit lower here. And then set up I think it's a pyrosource, pyrosolver, and volume source. So here, yeah, I guess it would be quicker to just use the shelf tool, but it's good to try and do it yourself as well. So we need 3. I need a density. I think I should set this to maximum. We need temperature. And velocity to target val. And that's a vector. So let's just see if this actually works. I'm going to also set my DOP to start at 124. Let me put in a resize. Well, I'm not seeing anything, so I'll probably set something up wrong. I'm just going to set the resize to track our source, just to make sure that my container is actually covering what we need it to cover. There we go. So we do have a working DOP here. It's not colliding with anything, and it's just floating up. So I'll leave that for now, and I'm just going to go ahead and boost some of these values. And I always start with going really crazy and then reining it down if I need to. So I mainly at this point just want to see that the velocity is working, and it looks like it is. And we're visualizing density, so that all looks fine. I'm going to hide the character now just to speed this up. Oops. DOP import fields. So I'm just racing through this setup just to make sure we have an actual working DOP. So there we have something. And as usual, I'm tweaking the value of the density to see what kind of result it gives me in the sim, because as I said before, it actually completely changes the way the simulation rolls as well. So always try low and high values. If it's not that important that you need an accurate density value, just try go up and down on that and see how it affects your simulation. You might be surprised how, if you're struggling to get a good looking sim, just multiplying the density by 10 or 100 can possibly get you closer to what you want. So that looks okay. I'm just going to reduce the buoyancy and add in a gas turbulence here and see if I can really get that smoke to move around that sphere. And then obviously we'll need to put in a collision object. So I just like to visualize the velocities of the turbulence when I first plug it in to check my turbulence scale and my actual amplitude. Make sure I get some red values in there so that I'm definitely having an effect, and then I can just rein in that scale number. I use the visualizer just to make sure that I will definitely see a result that reflects having plugged the gas turbulence in, and to make sure that the scale of those visualized lines looks about right to me. And then it's just a matter of adjusting one value after that to dial in how much turbulence there is. So I guess we want this kind of largish turbulence here to really try and push large sections of the volume around. Once again, I don't want to spend too much time tweaking this. It's more kind of just quickly building this part of the network until it works and does what I need it to do, and then the rest of the time can be spent tweaking that. So let's get our collision object in as well. So I'm just going to put down a static collision object, and I'll let the DOP generate the volume for me this time. So just check this is working. Let's see if it actually collides. So you can see parts of the volume are appearing outside the sphere and then get removed. So we're just left with the inside. So we will probably have to edit the way the pop advection works so that we don't end up with points that appear outside the sphere and then refuse to get advected inside that volume. So we'll see how that looks, but at the moment I'm pretty happy with this, because what I ultimately want is for the sphere to feel like it's filling up, and the more volume we get moving around here, the more we can play with the point cloud once we get the advection working. So that seems to be working pretty well for me. and I can see the velocity is having its effect on the source volume there. So let's leave it at that for now, and let's put down our pop system as well. Let me save. So at this point we can use the same points here as our pop source. And I'm just going to take this noise and I'll apply it to the color. Not really seeing anything. Oh, because I'm not looking at it. There we go, something like that. So for the same reason I did this with the portal, is I just want some range in the source. And as those particles get advected around, some of those points will be brighter, some of them will be darker, and it will help just add to the complexity of the effect. So I can tweak that later as well, and then we just want to drop that into a PopNet. And I'll put the volume here as the second input. I'm just going to actually make the volume sim use 2 substeps, just because I am adding quite a lot of velocity in there. So it might be hard to get this PopNet to behave, but we'll see. It's a little bit slow. I'm going to put down a cache node here. So I'll just be caching some of this volume sim, just a small amount probably, into memory here, so it's quicker to adjust settings on the pop sim. I think I'll need to go back and put in some ROPs here so we can speed up this waiting time. Right, so we have our source. We want to use all points, and I'm just going to set an age here, life expectancy of 1. Everything else is probably fine. And let's put in a advect by volumes, second input, update velocity, and trace. And there you have it. So we actually have quite a lot of impacts going on here. I think too many, it's just going to be crazy. So I can tweak, I can try just having 1 impact every few frames or something like that, just to tame it down. So that seems to be working fine, but as I said, some of the points, they sort of stop moving or stop being advected, and it's because they've moved into this area where the volume was, and then the volume was removed. So now the points are just sitting there. But the points that are inside the sphere are still moving around. So I need to put down a wrangle and constrain those point positions inside the sphere. So this is a sort of cheap particle collision method that I use quite a lot actually. And because I'm not the most proficient at wrangling, I'm going to put down a wrangle outside the pop first, just so I can test it, and then I'll copy that code and paste it inside the PopNet. So what I need is I need a ISO offset SDF from the sphere. And I use ISO offset because I've tried a VDB SDF and it does weird stuff. So there's an SDF for our PopNet. Let's just get a few frames here. And I'll see if I can code this collision first go. I'm always forgetting the particulars of the syntax, or which parts of the code are supposed to have small letters or capital letters. So we'll see how that goes for me. Okay, so that should be enough to test. I'm going to use up input 3 because I'm going to be using input 3 in the DOP, I think. So what we need is we need a float that determines the distance from the surface. So we sample that SDF, and this is the part I can never remember. I think it's like that. So we call the name of that SDF at P. So basically what I'm looking for, and if I look at this SDF just to describe, so the surface, so where there's volume and where there's no volume, there's a surface, that's 0, and the value is minus, so it's a value below 0 as you head into the volume, and it's a positive value as it goes out. So if you're looking for something's value outside or inside of the SDF, it's either above 0 or below 0. So we want to find out how much the particle is above 0, and then subtract from its position that amount of distance, so that every time a point should be outside, it's moved in this direction based on the volume gradient to the surface of the volume. So I'll describe that again when I've written out the code here. So right now we have a variable that tells us how far the point is away from the surface. So we can say if distance is greater than 0, so if it's outside the sphere, then, and this is where we need to determine our gradient. So we'll say gradient equals, and we use another volume sample, but we just use volume gradient, and then we put in the same stuff here. So the volume gradient of that surface should work, and that gives us the vector, so the direction. So we have how far it is away from the sphere, and then by checking the volume gradient, which is basically the normal of that surface, it gives us a direction. So we know in which direction to move the point back. And now we know by how much, which is the distance. So we say P, and that's the position of the particle, minus equals the normalized gradient because we don't need an amplitude, we just need a direction. That should be it, multiplied by the distance. So we've got the direction, multiply that by the distance, gives us how far we need to move it in that direction. And there you go. So we've forced the points to stay inside of that SDF. And I could do the same, so if they were inside the SDF, so less than 0, then I could add to the particle's position. Ooh, oh, you still subtract, yeah, because you're multiplying it by the distance. So you force all the points from inside to the surface, which could also be really useful in some cases. In this case, I want to force the points inside the sphere, but I want to do that every frame of the simulation so that those points get picked back up in the advection. So I'll copy that now, come back to our PopNet and add in a wrangle here. So op input 3, I just need to set input, well, just to be sure, I'll set the third context and input 3. I'm not sure which one it's looking at. Probably just this, but it also happens to be in third context. So let's just double check that. I'm not sure that's working. Oh, I haven't plugged it in. Still very slow. I guess I should be working with a lower res volume and maybe less points in that source I've got. There you go, that works. So that's pretty much what we need. And you can see we're already getting a pretty dynamic feel to it. And those points are no longer sitting around static because they're getting forced back into the volume that's actually moving. So at this point, I mean, the most fun part about a setup that now works, so this part works, is messing around with that volume sim and messing around with how these particles are being advected. So I'm going to boost this velocity. But obviously you want this to be as fast to simulate as possible at this point, because this is just the experimenting phase. And after the pop sim, we can base the color on age again, and sort of they should be bright as soon as they hit, and they'll quickly fade off in color. So that's working nicely. And then instead of a separate pop, I'm just going to duplicate this, and I can add a group for each one. And let's try instead of update velocity, update force. So we just push those points around instead of pull them in the volume. It's just going to apply a force, and the points will just move as particles do. Let's just disable that. So you can see the result is much more extreme, because the points aren't being forced to maintain the velocity of the volume, they're just being pushed out. So if we plug in the collision object again, they're being pushed out, pulled into the surface, and then pushed again. And it's not like they slow down by themselves, but they would completely carry on moving forever, but they keep getting pulled back into the sphere. So I think, I mean, maybe my velocity is pretty extreme, but that could definitely be a useful sim to really add a pop to something that moves quite extremely. Just going to flipbook this quickly actually so we can see. And once we've seen this, I think I'll stop this video and work on it a bit. Make sure I've got groups for each pop. Clean up what we have and probably write out some geometry to try and make this sourcing a lot quicker. And when we come back, we'll see what we have in terms of my particle sims, and then see where we can take it from there. But there's plenty to play with at this point, and I think this video might be quite long already. But we've set up a volume, we have collisions working for the volume, and now we have a very neat and tidy particle advection system based on that volume inside our shield. So I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty cool. And if we sort of combine something like this, which is using just a force, with the points that are much more tame, which is using the velocity from the volume, then I think we could get something really interesting. And there you can already see, because our collision object is actually being removed at frame 163, the points are just let go. So we're already getting some pretty nice interaction there. So let me save, and I'll get ready for the next video. I'll see you then. Hi. So I've been through this setup now, and I've written out in a bunch of areas to try and help speed it up. So I have a few ROPs, and I've basically written out some of the pop sim stuff, and then obviously the volume simulation, I've written that out, and then I've cached out the particles. So besides that, nothing much has changed except for some cleanup. And I'll just show you inside the PopNet. I have gone with 3 separate sourcing arrangements here for the one particle sim. So just to give you a quick overview of what those are, I haven't changed. 2 of them are the same as the ones we made in the previous video, and then I've added a 3rd one. So if we look at these 2, I put down a pop group and just called one of them main pop and second pop. And basically the main one is, and let me bring up the flipbook. So here you can see I've merged 2 of them together and just gave them colors so we could see how they look apart from each other. The yellow one is the main one. So that's basically the particle sim that's being 100% advected by the volume sim. And the purple one, I'm using the volume as a force, not as a velocity advector. But I'm still forcing the points to remain inside the sphere. So I'm pretty happy with this, because what I get is a sort of like a very dynamic interaction in the yellow from, say, how the shield would be reacting to the impact. But then I get a blast kind of shockwave from the purple element. So every time there's a bright flash, it's followed by this shockwave effect that ripples through almost the whole shield. So I think that's actually turned out very effective. It adds an extra high speed, highly dynamic element to each impact. And then for the 3rd one, what I've done is I've just, instead of using all points in the source, I've just used points, and I've set a much lower value. So if I let me just check. So this is also just set to update velocity, so it's pretty much the same as the main sim. So I can take a look here, and what did I call it? Inner pop. So I have a plan for this one, and it's to add an internal network of lines basically, which I'm hoping would be the sci-fi element. So where these layers are looking pretty magical, we can add a sci-fi element here. So I've reduced the amount of points, and basically I want to try and use those points to connect adjacent pieces on those points to generate some interesting lines and triangles inside. So let's just see if this is working. So if you have a look here, the difference in point count is pretty drastic. So let me write that out quickly. So the downside to doing it the way I've done it now is obviously I'm actually simming the whole DOP again. So every single one of these layers is simming just to generate the one layer. So it's not ideal. And for me, I did it in that way because, as you saw, I was just experimenting basically inside the DOP. So it's extremely quick to plug in new sources, try different settings, and just merge it all together to get a very quick update on what I want to try. Luckily, this isn't a super slow sim, but it's kind of one of the byproducts of the way I like to work, which is as quick as possible and experimenting as much as possible. So make this bigger. So this kind of approach is great for experimenting and getting really interesting results quickly, because I can try different options without even leaving the DOP. But once you're done, it would be better to copy these out into their own DOPs so that you don't have to rerun the whole sim every time you just want to update one of these. So they were left with pretty much exactly the same sim as the main one, but much fewer points. So let's see what we can do with that. My idea was to use connect adjacent, which is usually you'll see being used to generate glue networks for rigid body sims. So I set that to connect adjacent points just to make sure it's using the points of our sim, and this looks pretty cool already. That's just drawing a line between each one of those points in the sim. So I like where that's going. I was worried it was going to flicker around and change too often, but it actually looks pretty stable as an effect. There's nothing crazy going on every time it reconnects or anything. So I really like that. So I'll keep that one in my back pocket as well. And you're probably starting to see a trend here along with the way we worked on the portal. I've I've funneled everything down through here, and I seem to be using the same setup to see if I can branch out with many different layers. So it's a good general approach and understanding of how to build on something very basic and to layer it all up, and it should hopefully look extremely complex when it's done. Alright, so these are the nodes I just dropped down to visualize. Let's jump back onto these main two and see what we need to do to kind of bring this home. So we've got these points. I'm just going to merge them together. And let's set some attributes here. And I'm going to actually put down a color as well, because what I want to do is just amplify the color we have here. So if I use ramp from attribute, set this to CD. So now we can remap the colors that we already have from the simulated points. And I basically just want to kind of cool off most of that sim. So we can cool off all the points so they cool a little bit quicker, and we keep the source, or the brightest points in the source, we make them a bit brighter. So like this value is arbitrary because we'll use this in the shader somehow, but it's more just to make sure we get a very drastic difference between what's considered the hot spots of the effect and then how quickly it cools into its cool spots. So this isn't basically an age thing at the moment, it's just the colors from our sim. I want the difference between the hot spots and the dark spots to be more extreme. So something like that, and then in this wrangle I'm going to take the color and multiply it by the actual age. So I'm going to put that into a ramp because I want the points to either disappear in terms of the alpha or the color before they're actually dead. So we'll make a ramp based on age divided by life. And we're just multiplying the existing color. So if I look at a bit down the line here, those older points should be going to 0 in the color. And then what I can do is just base the alpha on CDX, say. So we get a bright flash, and the points start to fade off the older they get. So that sort of cleans up that sim a bit. And I'm just going to set an arbitrary p-scale here when we move on to our test rendering. So something small. And then I'll put down another color and we'll just define the basic look, because what I do want to do here is, if we sort of replicate this with all of our experiments here, I want to merge those all together and then potentially adjust the colors for each layer together, so we can define the look of the whole effect before we even jump into shading and rendering. So I'm just going to remap color again, but we'll change this to some nice goldy yellow color. And I always try and define the saturated color here, and then I'll kind of bank that, so that becomes my cool saturated color. So that's from there I choose the hot version of that. So less saturated, and then brighten that up. So I kind of end up with that kind of ramp. So I've chosen my base saturate, and then I pull it back and I ramp right up to make my hotspot. So at the moment I'm not 100% sure what I want, but I'll stick to something like this. So there we're completely independent of the alpha as well. So those points will just keep existing until they fade away into nothing, but we'll make sure we have some control over the color of the bright spots and of the color that those bright spots turn into afterwards. So something like that. And then obviously the big thing we're missing is we need to make an inverse transform of one of these transforms here. So we have, let's take this one. So we have the shield itself, and this is the animated one, and then we're moving it to the origin. So what I need to do is make a reference copy of that, because at the end of this whole network we need to obviously move the effects back to the moving position. So invert transforms, and there we should have the moving shield. So I'm going to flipbook this. Just to test it out. So this has moved forward, it's obviously not still at the origin, and now it's sliding back along the floor. So that seems to be working fine. So that's good. What I've done with that is I've proven that the system works. So now we can really get stuck into the fun part and start messing around with these layers, similar to the way we did with the portal. We had some base sims to work with, and then I just kind of went mad and tried things. So I'm going to take these sims in the next video, and we can try a bunch of other SOP techniques I usually use to just kind of make it look as good as possible. So I'll see you then. Hi, welcome back. So in the previous video, what I did was just take some of these particle sims we made and add the attributes that we need to make them renderable, pretty much, and double check that transforming them back into the animated position was working. So that's fine, that all worked well. And then I have this idea that I have on the side for later as well, which is our sci-fi idea. So next we'll be adding some, basically trying a bunch of SOP tricks to add extra layers to our main effect here. But before we do that, I just want to do a quick detour and add our projectiles. Just by adding the projectile, it will be a bit more easy to visualize. So if I can at least do some flipbooks that include the tracer that comes in and hits the shield, I think it will help to make sure that our impacts feel strong enough. So as I said before, you basically only need 2 frames to sell the trajectory of something, and to have it still feel fast and impactful. So we have points that are sourcing on the edge of the sphere. So all I need to do is copy a line onto each one of those points, and then the frame before, move that line out further away based on that normal. So when we play it back, we should get 2 frames. We'll get a frame of the tracer here, and then a frame just as it makes contact with the sphere. So if we look at, say, our source points, so here's the sphere, and we're scattering some points on it, and those normals are pointing roughly in Z, if I can find any. There we go. So these are our impact points. So if we look at this through the camera, those impact points are spherical now. So in other words, the normals are pointing in all directions on positive Z. So I do need to try and repoint those normals so that it feels more like the gunfire is happening just behind the camera instead of from all the way around. So let me put down a point SOP, and I actually prefer the old point SOP, but let's give it a go. I'm still old school like that. So we got a point. Let's look at least 2 impacts here. So it's a bit tricky to work like this because we don't have very many points, but you can see there's 2 points. The normals are pointing in these directions. And the reason I want to edit the normals is because I can base the copied geometry direction based on those normals. So there's a million ways to repoint these normal directions, and I'm just going to give this a go. So basically, if I change the position, so say I move these points down here, plug that in as a second input. Then we have the old position and we have the transform position. So I can point the normal in the direction of the transformed position. So we set the point SOP to normal, and there should be a preset here. The only thing I can see is second input's position, but that's not actually perfect. Let's have a look. So if I make that really long, you can see the direction of the normals passing through it. So I think I just subtract. So let's normalize this first of all, because we only need a direction for now. And we want to say input 1, so the new position, minus the old position, input 0 underscore p. So all we're doing there is the normal is based on taking this position minus this position. So that gives us the direction between the two. And you can see that's lining up perfectly. So maybe let me scatter some more so we can visualize here. Look at this through the camera. So that already feels better. If I take that off, you can see these are pointing, some of them are pointing kind of to the sky and to the ground. We want to make sure they're pointing out behind the camera, and then I can easily just come and scale this. So I can scale this, these 2 points down, move them up, bring them closer, take them further away. so we can have them feel like they're really coming from one enemy. So this is basically like us just tweaking this until we're happy with the general direction that we want the gunfire to come from. So I'll go with something like that for now. And I'll add this in here. So we basically just edited the normal of our source points. And I can write this back out. And there we go. So they're crazy long now because I didn't take away the scale. I put a multiplier here of 83. Oh, and I have 10 times too many points. So let's try that again. There we go. So there's our new impact points, and the only difference is they have a normal. That should hopefully be useful to us. And there you can see better. They're kind of firing from somewhere here. So let's just use that and copy a line onto it. So I'm going to make a line, and we just need to point this in Z. And that's because when it gets copied onto points with a normal, it'll base the direction of that object based on the normal. So if this is pointing on, I'll show you. This is pretty basic stuff, but I think I'll just describe what I'm doing here. So you see there, I've copied a line onto those points, and immediately the line is matching exactly the direction of the normal, and that's because the line is oriented to Z. It's not because the environment or the camera or the direction we're working with is on Z. It's literally because a line on the Z axis will be transformed perfectly to a normal. So if I had the default settings, my line would just look like that. So as long as you orient an object on Z and then copy it on with something that has a normal, it will inherit that direction. So here we have essentially the final frame of the projectile before the impact effects happen. So you see we just need one more frame pretty much to sell that trajectory. So what else do I need? We can lengthen this up a bit. Make sure we've got a bunch of points in there. And right now, before we do anything else, I'm going to add a new attribute on this line for a mask. So I just need to say a float attribute mask, which is based on $PT divided by $NPT. So take the point and divide it by the amount of points in the line, and that'll give us a ramp from 0 to 1. Now, how do we get the second, or rather the first frame of the projectile? So all we need is for this point, the source point, to exist one frame before it actually gets created. So let's time shift this. So we have these points, and I'll say $f+1. So that point, this branch now exists one frame earlier than our real branch. And it exists for 2 frames. So I can base the position of this line based on age because we use the pop. So let's see if I can do that just in here. So we have our translate on Z will give us, we'll move that copied object along the axis of the normal, not necessarily on the axis of Z. So we can base this on age. So if age is, let me think about this. So if age is low, let me use numbers first. So 0 is our point of contact, and the frame before would be, say, 2.2. So we actually want to subtract age, or let's try that. So 2.2 minus age. No, this, it's capital. So in theory this works, but I would be working with a sort of random value here because my age needs to be divided by life. So what I'm actually going to do here is make another attribute on this point. Let's just call this pos for position, and we'll do age divided by life. So that should at least give us our value between 0 and 1. Let's have a look at the spreadsheet here. So pos. So we have, yep. So we have a value that's going from low to high. But we can round that to give us a value that's either 0 or 1. So let's say if we do round, so what we said was about, say, 3 minus pos. So I'm just trying to see if this is actually working or doing anything. Let's just make sure my attributes are coming through. So there's a point there. Here's our line. So we want to say take pos. So there we can see it's going in the wrong direction. So we definitely want to subtract pos. So that's working fine, and then like I said, if we round it, we should get 1 and 0. Not quite. So that's not quite giving me what I want, because I guess I'm still getting an offset of 1. I could also try dividing this. So I'm just messing around here to try and figure out how I'm going to get what I want. It's a pretty basic thing to set up, but I feel slightly like I might be overthinking this. This is working, so I'm getting a frame here, and this is offset by age divided by lie. So that's, at the moment, that's 1 minus 0, because the age is something like 0.1, and it's being rounded. So that should be rounded to 1. And then the next frame, the age is probably over 0.5. So we round that 1 minus 0.6 or something will give us 0. So we have an offset and then 0 offset there. If I multiply that whole thing, it's giving me a greater offset on the frame before, because the second frame, it's being multiplied, it's 0 multiplied by 2. So no matter what, the second frame will always be the impact frame, and the frame before, we can choose how far we want that just by multiplying this. So that works. I just had I think I was struggling with overthinking it there for a bit. So there you can see we have 2 frames of projectiles. And that should be all we need. Let me go in here and add a color as well. So we have this mask attribute on the line. I can take actually this nice orangey color I've got down here. Based on mask. So we just want to make sure we've got a hot front end of our tracer, and then it can go dark or transparent out the back. So at this point I would also probably duplicate something for our alpha. Or we have, I do need a width as well, because we can just render this line. We don't really need to scatter points or put down a poly wire, nothing like that. So let's see, if I do CD, don't think I need that. I just need an alpha based on color, and then our width can be based on the alpha as well, multiplied by something. We don't need to worry too much about that, and we can look at these values again when we're rendering. But here we just have an alpha, so that's cool. And then I'm also going to pop down a noise. So we'll revisit this when we start looking at the render setups, but the likelihood is we need a velocity attribute, and we can change that value unrealistically long. So the point is, if you add some noise to this line, just subtle, and then you make sure that motion blur is blurring this projectile quite a lot, then that noise kind of blends all into one thing that still feels like a line, but it feels like a more detailed version. Not to mention, if you look at a lot of reference of traces, you'll see they are quite noisy. So we just want to add a 3D noise to P. And then we can also plug in some, like the frame number into offset so that it moves, just so that they never appear the same. And we can multiply that noise by that mask we have. So these lines already have a mask from the start to the end of the line. And we pretty much don't want the front end of the projectile to be so messed up. Okay, so here you can see I'm adding noise, but not to the front part. I can add a little bit to the front. And then this just needs to be much more subtle. So just something like that is enough, because when this is motion blurred, you should get an interesting level of detail out the back of this projectile. So there they are. And I will just do a flipbook quickly using these merged with what we have down here. And in the next video we can carry on with the really fun stuff here and mess around with our particle sims. Ooh, some of these are crazy noisy. But we can see these are working fine. So I'll probably mess around with the trajectory to make sure they feel like they're actually coming somewhat from behind camera instead of always from the left. And then obviously the noise is way too crazy at the moment. And you'll only rarely get the full effect of these once you render them, because I'll have that width attribute and the slightly transparent tail. They won't look as obviously just lines. But it's still a helpful visualizer here as we move on with the rest of the effects, just to see something flying into the shield before each impact. And I think at some point we'll come back and add some more of these hitting the ground and maybe the back wall before the shield actually appears. So that's a good start. I'll end this here and we'll come back in the next one and mess around with these particle sims. So I'll see you then.